Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scream Scene, the horror movie podcast where we watch every horror movie ever made in chronological order, and then we rank them from best to worst. My name's Ben.
And I'm Sarah.
Thank you so much for listening to us today. How you doing, Sarah?
Well, when we are recording this, it is the end of summer, easing into spooky season.
Right.
So overall, doing pretty good.
I wish that it wasn't still so hot.
Yeah.
But it is a little weird, like the new way that we're kind of trying to do the show and record things. I don't know when this episode will come out, like when listeners will hear this, but it's been a really busy summer for us. We had like weddings to go to and all kinds of exciting things. And it's been a really busy season at my work. We had like a really successful summer season, and it's been good, but I'm also feeling really tired.
Yeah.
And so it just feels like a lot sometimes. So I'm feeling a little tired today, but hopefully, we'll have a good time recording the show, have a nice fun episode for the people.
I am excited for tonight's movie. So why don't you share what we're watching?
Yeah, absolutely. So tonight we are watching The HANDS of ORLAC from 1960. And this is the third ORLAC adaptation that we have now covered on the show. It was produced sort of in an attempt to hop on the Anglo horror bandwagon started by Hammer.
Okay.
So this isn't a Hammer film, but it like definitely wants you to sort of think it's in that mold, I guess.
But this is a French novel.
And that didn't stop the Germans or Americans from adapting it before.
But calling it an Anglo horror movie, like trying to like cash in on the Anglo horror trend is odd to me, because then there's like a whole swath of English literature. Why choose a French novel?
Yeah, I don't really know. But it's not like Frankenstein was set in England anyway, so...
Well, as Ben said, we've seen this movie twice before, and it comes from a French novel, as I said. So that French novel is called Les Mains d'Orlac by Maurice Renard. It was a novel published in 1920, so it's not even like, 1800s novel. Maurice Renard, he was born in France in 1875. He was greatly influenced by H.G. Wells, and he tended to blend science fiction and fantasy genres, which I feel like is a good reminder that certain genre demarcations may be more recent than you think.
Genre is fake, despite the premise of this podcast.
But also like the thesis of this podcast, I really feel. In amongst the stories of mad scientists transplanting organs between people, animals, plants, and machine, and perhaps some stories about invisible atmosphere living aliens fishing for men on Earth, Renard penned Les Mains d'Orlac in 1920 about a renowned pianist that has an accident and has his hands transplanted from a serial killer, and he begins to fear that he has also inherited those murderous intentions. Ultimately, this is a detective story about blackmail. 4 years after the novel was published, we saw the film adaptation occur in Germany by Robert Weiner, starring Conrad Veidt. There was no better choice to portray the inner turmoil, which was of particular interest to Veidt and Werner, with the growth of German Expressionism and that movement being at its height in 1924. So we covered that movie in episode 12. It's currently ranked at number 146 out of 289. It was a fairly good showing with a lot of mood and body and psychological horror, particularly coming from Veidt's performance. It had some really, really wonderful shadows, but ultimately the movie struggled with adapting the blackmail part of the novel.
The thing about Hands of Orlac that I always remember is just that, like, the plot is way more convoluted than it needs to be.
Because it's a detective story.
Right.
Without a detective.
Yes.
There was a new adaptation in 1935 in America by German filmmaker Carrel, who chose a looser adaptation. While we do include that inner body and psychological horror portrayed by Colin Clive as Orlac with his transplanted hands, Peter Lorre's mad scientist, Dr. Gogol, steals the show. His entire plan is that he is in love with Orlac's wife, who is an actress, and if he can get the husband, Orlac, out of the way with the idea that he's a murderer post-hand surgery, then his wife will be Gogol's for sure. With this movie, we praise the shadows, the cinematography, Laurie's acting. All of those contributed to giving this a very strong showing, ultimately being ranked at number 55, which is still pretty good because we covered that in episode 52, and it's currently episode 311.
Woof. Yeah, that is still pretty high on the list.
Yes. Now, 259 episodes and 25 years later, we'll see how this British-French production handles the material. I am particularly excited because it's going to be, yes, a co-production, but at least a French co-production, and to see what happens when French adapt a French novel.
Yeah, for sure. I'm also interested to see like how much more advanced the story's portrayal of like the psychological elements may be now that we're in like 1960 and that's the new wave of horror is kind of delving into those aspects a lot more.
Yeah, as seen with Psycho and Peeping Tom in particular this year.
I'm also interested to see like what new wrinkles the plot gets this time.
Yeah, consistently people have had troubles with the blackmail part. They really like the inciting incident.
Yes.
But then the rest of it tends to kind of go off the rails.
I keep waiting for one of these adaptations to ditch the like Scooby-Doo ending of this story, which feels very like old-fashioned now. So yeah, we'll see what new wrinkles the adaptation brings this time around, whether it owes more to Mad Love or the original novel or what. I've never seen this iteration. And from what I understand, it's like not very widely seen.
Okay, potentially a hidden classic.
I hope so. The director here is Edmond Gréville, who also co-wrote the screenplay adapting the novel. Gréville was born in France in 1906 in Nice. He was a Russian Jewish orphan who was adopted by an English father and French mother. From a young age, he was kind of bouncing between England and France. He began his film career as a journalist and critic, and then took like bit roles in silent films and early talkies. In 1930, he began directing short films, and between 1930 and 1940, he directed several feature films, sometimes French, sometimes English.
So this seems like a pretty good choice for the movie then.
He certainly like has the experience. Some of his pictures, like 1934's Rameau and 1938's Menaces, dealt with complex and mature subject matter that would run him afoul of censors. Rameau is about male impotence, and Menaces is about an Austrian who ends his own life after the Anschluss, the German annexation of Austria.
Oh, okay.
During the Second World War and occupation of France, Gréville was living in France, and he couldn't get any work because he was a French Jew. But after the war, he directed But Not in Vain, an Anglo-Dutch co-production about the Dutch resistance during the war.
Nice.
Through the 1950s, he continued to make both English and British films. The Hands of Orlac is actually one of his last movies because he would pass away in 1966 in Nice following a car accident.
Oh no.
Gréville called low-budget filmmaking a challenge that should inspire a director to higher things. Although Hands of Orlac was largely a British production, it shot both in London and on location on the French Riviera. The crew was British for the London shoot and French for the location shooting, and each scene was shot in English and French, creating two alternate versions of the movie.
Which we've kind of seen before, like with Spanish Dracula, though that had different actors. These are the same actors?
Yes. So this is kind of closer to what happened with Vampire. Although with Vampire, a big part of that was that movie's kind of half a silent movie anyways. And so reshooting the few parts that had dialogue in English, French, and German, like, wasn't a big deal. Here, the entire movie is shot twice with the same cast rather than like dubbing the picture. Desmond Dickinson, the cinematographer for Laurence Olivier's 1948 version of Hamlet, shot this film. Theoretically, it should look good. And the movie was also edited by Oswald Hafenrichter, who edited The Third Man.
Okay.
So it should be edited really well, too. Starring as Stephen Orlac in this version is American actor Mel Ferrer, who we just saw most recently as the male lead in Roger Vadim's Blood and Roses.
That's inaccurate. We most recently saw him in an episode of Columbo.
Right, that we watched like the other day. But I mean, like on the show, we most recently saw him in Blood and Roses. I do want to say we watched that picture. We had, if I'm remembering correctly, like mixed feelings about it. Like,
yeah, it was fine.
There were things that we really liked and things we didn't. I find myself listening to the score a lot. I found out in checking while doing research for this episode that we made it a non-horror movie, like we put it on miscellaneous. And it's been really interesting because since we've watched it, I've talked to like several other people about that movie. Like we bandied it about as like potentially showing it for like Cinematheque this October. Like, I don't know, it's just come up a lot lately. So I just wanted to point that out, I guess. Mel Ferrer was starring in a string of European films at this time, following the birth of his son, Sean, earlier this year in Switzerland with his wife, Audrey Hepburn. So they were, I guess like in Europe while, Sean was very young. And so this is just where he was taking jobs at this time.
Okay. I also didn't know he was married to Audrey Hepburn. Maybe I knew when we covered Blood and Roses, but like, damn, he shot above his weight class and he won.
By the time he was in that episode of Columbo we watched, they had gotten divorced. But
yeah, that's like 10, 15 years from now.
In the role of the movie's villain, we have our blackmailer, who in this movie is not the surgeon.
He like was in Mad Love.
Right.
But they were also separate in Hands of Orlac.
Yes.
Sorry, Orlac's Honda.
Yes.
To be clear about which one I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the role of the blackmailing Nero, we find our good pal Christopher Lee, for whom, of course, the multilingual nature of the production posed no issue at all. 28-year-old French actress Dany Carrel plays the film's femme fatale.
Ooh.
She was born Yvonne Suzanne Chazelle du Chassel in French Indochina to a French father and Vietnamese mother. The character she's playing here is listed as Regina/Li Lang. So I don't know what ethnicity the character is supposed to have, but the actress at least is of mixed ethnicity. So it's not quite like...
I feel like we saw a documentary where actresses at this time and older, if they were of mixed backgrounds, they tended to get slotted into femme fatales because as an audience member, quote unquote, enjoy their foreignness and exoticness while also having an arm's length away from them. And they often get a bad ending.
Yes, absolutely, which is a unfortunate product of older movies that I feel like by 1960s starting to get a little...
old hat?
Yes. French actress Lucile Saint-Simon plays Orlac's wife, who is called Louise in this version, while the rest of the cast is rounded out with experienced Shakespearean performers like Felix Aylmer and Donald Wolfett. Donald Pleasance also appears in this movie in a very small role as an artist who wants to sculpt Orlac's hands.
And then the statue goes to kill people.
Right.
Sorry.
The Hands of Orlac was released in the UK in December of 1960 and in France on May 16th, 1961.
December 1960? Mm-hmm. Are we almost done this year then?
Yes. We have one more 1960 movie after this.
Okay.
And then we will be free of 1960. Hands of Orlac was not critically well received, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
It was accused of being old-fashioned, uninventive, boring, and banal.
Oh, no.
It
feels a lot like the movie we just watched.
Yeah. There also aren't a lot of good home video options available for this movie today. It seems like the English version got a VHS release, And nothing really since then. The French version got like a DVD release 20 years ago. Both of these releases seem to be from companies that don't exist anymore.
Oh no.
It's on YouTube, both the English and the French version. The English version is of lesser video quality than the French. So we're going to have to make a choice about what version we're going to watch for the purpose of the podcast, because I don't think we want to watch both.
No, we're not watching both. My gut is saying French because it's like French director and it's a French novel. It's kind of the closest we're getting to a French adaptation of a French novel. So that's my vote.
Okay. Well, to check out the French version, because at least it's also in higher quality, so we'll be able to judge the cinematography and other elements more fairly. Probably, like, my guess is that at least Mel Ferrer probably gives a more natural performance in English. But as I said, Christopher Lee is kind of good either way. It seems odd, like most of the men in the cast seem to be English and most of the women seem to be French. So you're getting somebody not talking in their natural language one way or the other. So we'll take a look at the French version. I think I'm going to put both in our Scream Scene YouTube playlist for people to kind of choose for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. If you would like to find that playlist, you can go to our website, screamscenepodcast.com, and find it there to watch along. You're going to hear a brief musical interlude, and when we come back, we will discuss The Hands of Orlac from 1960, directed by Edmond Gréville.
See you on the other side, everybody.
Welcome back to Scream Scene. We just finished watching Les Mains d'Orlac, The Hands of Orlac from 1960, directed by Edmond Gréville. Ben?
I can see why this version has been forgotten.
Yes, because there's not much to remember it by.
This is one of the worst movies I've ever seen for this podcast that was like still made by competent professionals.
Yeah.
Where it's like these people know how to use a camera and how to like block a scene, and you know, like this is a real movie. It doesn't have that like amateur like failure at being a movie thing that a lot of bad sci-fi horror movies have. Like, this isn't an Ed Wood picture. This is a professional grade movie, and I hate it.
Like, you brought up Ed Wood.
Yeah.
The thing about someone who doesn't know what they're doing is, A, there's an opportunity to see something you've never really seen before.
Sure.
Like, you kind of get that with, like, Citizen Kane, for example.
Right.
But also, B, there's, like, an endearing quality to it.
For sure.
It's like, oh, there's the boom mic. Like, oh, they just glued fur to that person's face. But, like, there's, I don't know, there's, like, a camaraderie in it because they're just normies. But these are professionals who should know better.
At least when you watch Bride of the Monster or Plan 9 from Outer Space, you get the sense that at least like Ed Wood wanted to make this movie.
Yeah, for normies to make something, they have to want it.
Right.
Whereas these guys, I think they were just like, well, obviously they were contracted in to make this movie, but there wasn't any like excitement about making this particular movie.
No, not at all.
Otherwise something would come through, but instead it's just so blah.
This movie comes across as extremely uninterested in telling its own story.
I will say Christopher Lee brings a level of like excitement.
Sure.
Because he is a professional. I was going to say because he is a professional, but what I mean is like his character's job is like he's the antagonist.
Sure.
So by the time that he shows up in the movie, which is like halfway.
Yes.
Which is ridiculous. He at least brings some excitement through his performance. But unfortunately, his script fucking sucks and doesn't make any fucking sense.
Let's talk about the story of this version of Orlac, which somehow is worse than all the other versions.
Well, it means that the silent version is probably the most accurate.
Right.
So, okay, I'll give the film synopsis, and then I do also have a synopsis of the novel, direct from the novel, so we can kind of like dig in a little bit more if we want.
Sure, okay.
So the film follows Stephen Orlac. He's a big pianist. He's just finished this huge performance and he's going to fly home to then propose to his girlfriend Louise. Unfortunately, the plane crashes just as his fiancée Louise is on the tarmac. So she rushes him to a hospital where there's a famous surgeon named Dr. Volchev, who is like famous for like renowned transplantations.
He's famous for experimental stuff, right?
He's just famous for being good at surgery.
Right.
That's it.
Okay.
So in order to get to the hospital, this is also a hospital that's like not necessarily closest because she wants the best surgeon.
Right.
So we have to cut past where there's a road closed down in front of a jail because there's going to be the execution of this like strangler, Louis Vesser. Now, Stephen is in and out of consciousness when he hears that, like, oh, we have to argue with the police to get through because of the execution of this strangler. And in this, like, traumatic state, he begins to kind of blur the lines of, like, his story and Vasseur's story and begins to believe that he actually gets a hand transplant from this executed prisoner. For us, the viewer, it is neither confirmed nor denied what fucking surgery he gets.
Yeah.
And what actually took ambiguous. Yeah. So the recovery finds Orlac having trouble playing. His rings and gloves don't fit. And so it's kind of just like contributing more and more to his fear of like, whose hands are these? Like, are these actually my hands? To take his mind off of it, Louise says, hey, my like great uncle lent us his villa in the French Riviera for a vacation.
I just want to say that like his hands have scars on them after the surgery
that don't align with the idea of a transplant.
No.
Yeah. So they get there. He's continuing to be a little like haunted by this idea. A cat shows up. It's like the villa's cat, but don't worry thinking that like, oh, where's it going to go with this cat? Because the next scene is the cat is dead, potentially strangled, potentially by like some hooligans around.
Or maybe by Orlac and his new strangler's hands.
Yeah. Who knows? He seems to think like the gardener suspects him of it, though the gardener like didn't do anything. And then we get almost a sex scene.
Mm-hmm.
The movie is like, it's like, oh, what year is this? 1960? Like, are the censors okay with this? Like, these two aren't even married, and they're making out on the bed, and then
fully clothed,
fair. And then Orlac goes to like, sort of slightly strangle Louise, and she's like, oh, like, you scared me a bit, and he freaks out over the idea that he was just about to strangle her. He also seems to have like extra strength in his hands.
The other thing about this scene, on paper, or maybe like if it was made today, this scene could like really work.
Yeah.
Like a scene where it's like a sex scene between them and like he gets all riled up and like without realizing it, like he's got his hands around her throat and he starts like choking her out and then like he's strangling her and then she freaks out because like, whoa, dude. And then he freaks out and like feels guilty and like runs off. That all could really work on paper. But that's not like really what's happening here. Instead, like they're just like making out on the bed. And then for no reason, he starts strangling her. Like, it's not like in the throes of doing something else.
I think what they were going for is what you described.
Yes, but like, it just doesn't come across that way. It's just like he puts his hands around her throat and gets this look on his face like, what if I strangled her though? And then he does. And then he's like, oh no.
So he runs off because he's like, oh God, what was I about to do? And she's like, where are you going? So he leaves for a city called Marseille, and that's where he meets Lelang and Nero. So Nero clocks who this is right away and is like, hey, Lelang, my like co-conspirator, go seduce him and we'll do that to blackmail him and get money because this guy's big famous. Lelang and Nero have this stage show where basically Nero does like magician illusions and she does singing and burlesque. But before their blackmail plot can really get off the ground, Louise finds Stephen. He tells her about his fears of these hands, and Nero overhears. So he begins plotting this new blackmail plot to basically encourage him to think that he does have the hands of Vasir. To what end? Blackmail, I guess. It's not very clear about how money will come in. And it continues to not be clear and in fact gets murkier.
It like only makes sense if you've seen other versions of the movie, because then at least you know what the blackmail plot is supposed to be.
So Orlac is getting increasingly paranoid. He tries to kind of get over it, and he begins to get ready to perform again. But before the big show, Nero sends him gloves that say Vasir on them, and they're clearly like Vasir's gloves. And so mid-performance, Orlac is playing the piano, and then he sees those gloves on his own hands, and he begins to kind of freak out. Kind of that paranoia hits a climax for him. So he runs off. As his paranoia grows, Nero gets Lelang to get into Orlac's house. Louise and Stephen have now officially been married, and they steal his keys, and they start to like try to make moves to make this blackmail plot work, but it doesn't really make sense again.
They're like gaslighting him into thinking that his hands are Vassar's, right?
But that also Louise and her uncle and godfather, who is like a psychologist or whatever, are going to institutionalize him because of this paranoia.
Where does that lead to something that you can get money out of someone for?
Yeah. And as things come to a head, Nero confronts Orlac at night, dressed up as Vasir, and does the iconic scene of like hooks for hands and as if his head's been reattached, but then takes off the mask in that same confrontation and laughs in Orlac's face.
Yeah, like, wasn't this such a silly thing for me to do?
Yeah.
It's very weird. Like, it's like this out of nowhere thing. We've not even seen Vassar in this movie. Like, we don't know what he looks like at all. And he just like kind of jumps out of the shadows with the mask on and the hook hands. And he's like, yes, like, Volchek gave you my hands, but he gave me my head back. Haha. And then just like immediately takes the mask off. He's like, actually, it's just me, Nero. Wasn't that funny?
But I'm actually your friend because I'm telling you that they're going to institutionalize you.
So then why did you just try to scare me like that?
Yeah.
The thing is that the person who tells Orlac that for sure his hands are Vassar's is Nero, because he's like, oh, like, I'm a crook. Vassar was a crook. I knew Vassar. Those are his hands. So like the only person providing Stephen with evidence of this is Nero, who also like has admitted to stealing his keys so that he could get in and do this like random middle of the night fright thing. Like he's basically like, hey, Orlac, I'm driving you crazy, but listen, I'm your friend, because I need to warn you that because I'm driving you crazy, your wife and her doctor relation are going to throw you in the madhouse. So like, we need to stop them from doing that. Aren't I your friend? And it's like, what?
Yeah. So while all that's going on, Louise goes to try to find Dr. Volchev to confirm, like, what was the actual surgery? To be fair, Stephen did try to contact the doctor, but he, like, left to Moscow for, like, a conference, so he was going to be gone that weekend. Didn't try to contact him again.
Mm-hmm.
Louise goes to Dr. Volchev, who is then also going into surgery, but not like to do surgery. Volchev literally is the patient going into surgery.
Yeah, he's had like a brain hemorrhage or something.
She's like, what do we do? Her psychologist uncle tries to help by like getting Stephen's fingerprints on like his like cigarette case or whatever, and then goes to the police. They're back in London, so this is now Scotland Yard, no longer back in Paris. And he's like, hey, Scotland Yard police, check these fingerprints with the French guy Vassir and tell me, like, do they match? Turns out they can't do that because twist that's revealed at the very end, but I will reveal now, Vasseur is innocent. They had the Paris police had reopened the case, so they can't say whether or not these fingerprints are Vasseur's, but they have discovered that Vasseur is innocent. So while, Lelang and Louise, they get to talk, and Lelang's like, yeah, I'm going to, go back on Nero, whatever. So Lelang gets killed by Nero in, the most, blasé way and, least visually interesting way on screen. Don't interrupt me. Let me finish. So, Nero's, cutting her up on stage in a box. Maybe we should interrupt me. Because I just stopped right there.
So here's the thing. So Lelang is I don't want to work for Nero anymore. I want to turn on him. I want to help you guys prove that he's the bad guy and take him to the police or whatever. And Nero overhears this.
Their stage gimmick is lock Lelang into a trunk, stick knives or these swords in, but we see that she actually sneaks out the back of the trunk so she doesn't get stabbed. Then she pops back in after the knives are taken out and she's fine.
Yeah, it's a standard magician's assistant trick.
Yeah.
And
Aiden cut me in half again.
Right.
We're good.
But
That's a deep cut Canadian reference.
But listen, what he does is he just locks her in the box and doesn't let her escape and just actually stabs her, right?
And all we see is blood leaking out of the bottom of the trunk.
But here's the real problem. It's not just that this is the first and only murder scene in this movie and it's really dull. His plan to get rid of his assistant is to
murder her on stage.
Right. Murder her on stage in a magic act that means that the moment he opens up the box for the usual prestige, she's there bleeding and dying. So then he just runs off stage to his dressing room and is haha, I've sure murdered her. And it's how did you think you were going to get away with this, my dude?
Yeah, the police are literally banging on his door. But in his dressing room, Stephen is there to confront him about all of this.
Oh, yeah, we did miss one, I think, very important part before this, which is that Nero does get Stephen worked up to the point where he does come out of the shadows and it looks like he's going to attack his wife and strangle her because he's been built up to believe that his wife is his enemy and that he has these strangler hands. So I guess I'm going to strangle my wife. But he doesn't do it. He stops himself and is oh, actually, everything's fine. So when he confronts Nero here, he's you made me try to kill my wife. And I think this is where the blackmail plot was supposed to be going, was that Nero was trying to gaslight him up into strangling his own wife, and then Nero would blackmail him for that crime. The problem with that is the way that blackmail works is I know you committed a crime, but no one else does, so you're going to pay me money to stop me from telling anyone. But if Orlac had strangled his wife,
people would fucking know.
Well, yeah, he would have felt probably super guilty about it. He would have gotten arrested. He would have gone to prison. So what are you going to try to do? Blackmail a dude who's already been arrested and gone to prison?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. Anyways, yeah, he's now Nero, attacking Nero.
Yeah, Nero is gotten by the police thanks to this confrontation. Orlac learns that Vasseur is innocent, so he has an innocent person's hands?
Yeah, we still don't know if he has Vasseur's hands or not, but I guess if Vasseur was innocent, it means that
his hands are fine.
They're not Strangler's hands, one way or the other.
Yeah, so it's all good. And then it ends with a performance. That's the end. It's what the fuck? So do you want me to go into what happens in the novel to make it clear how much this fucking deviates?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, so the novel is from the wife's point of view, and it's explicit that it was a transplant. Now, the hands aren't from a strangler, but rather a killer who would throw knives. It follows Yvonne going through financial woes while her husband recovers, but that she and Orlac both fear about the hands and his sanity. Now, Orlac's father disapproved of his pianist career, and after an argument is found dead with a throwing knife as the murder weapon. They find the fingerprints of the executed prisoner on the knife. And so Stephen Orlac, again, like going through that whole fear of like, well, I must have been the one who killed him. Like, I don't remember doing it, but it must have been me. And these must be the hands. How else would the fingerprints be on the knife? Now, a criminal named Nira poses as Vasseur with like the reconnected neck to try to blackmail Orlac for the inheritance coming from the father.
Mm-hmm.
It's revealed at the end that Vasseur was actually innocent. It was this random, like, Nira criminal who had been doing all of the murders, and he's ultimately apprehended. But he has that iconic confrontation scene. It's in, like, the basement of a pub. But the pose of, like, no hands, obviously fake, but, like, no hands and, like, the reconnected neck. That gives you an idea of like what the blackmail is supposed to be like.
Yeah, it makes sense because he committed a crime that he can be blackmailed for.
Yeah. Yeah. So despite this 1960 version being the most French, it is the least accurate in its adaptation.
We did, after watching the French version, watch like a couple scenes from the English version just to see what it was like, and it wasn't better.
They do apparently vary slightly with some of its exposition and like saying what happens. Like the French version of finding Volchev going into surgery is like a nurse is talking about Volchev and saying like, oh, you know, these geniuses, they're like sorcerers until something bad happens. But in like the English version, it's apparently clearer that he's had like a brain aneurysm or something. The differences aren't enough that it would be like, oh, this makes sense in one language but doesn't in another.
Also, like it's not like it's better written in English. Like it's like Christopher Lee is over the top like it's silly regardless.
Oh, I will say that the reconciliation plot post Marseille is longer in the French version, which is what we watched, and I did find it a bit long because this is supposed to be a horror movie, guys.
Okay, let's talk about that. This is not a horror movie.
No.
It doesn't rank.
Maybe we, like, yes, we will talk about this, but I feel like we need to hold our horses just a bit.
Sure.
Because I think the crux of why this doesn't work as a movie is the fact that the question of, like, the hands being transplanted or not is not answered.
So part of me thinks that this story just really isn't meant for film.
That's fair.
Because like the whole conflict of Orlac obsessing over his hands is so internal. It doesn't really play visually. Like it has so many contrivances that I feel like you can forgive in like an early 20th century novel that become like less and less forgivable as time goes on. Like the idea that he would look at his hands and not be sure if they're his or some other guy's.
You would need to have narration from his point of view in a movie version.
Well, he would need to have gotten his hands so badly fucked up that even after the operation, they're so like scarred up that there would be a question, because like there's a reason why like I know it like the back of my hands is a phrase, right?
Yeah.
So this idea in this version that he's unsure about it, I mean, you know, I can complain more about this when I talk about how tame this movie is, but when we see him after the accident, the plane crash, all they've done is they've kind of dipped his hands in movie blood, like in fake blood. They don't look burned or anything. They're just bloody.
Yeah, they don't look mangled. The rest of him is fine.
And then after the surgery, he's got like some scars on his hands, but it's not like burn scars. They're like cut scars or something. So this idea that he's not sure, it works if you're in a novel and you can kind of be inside someone's thought process, but also you aren't directly like seeing things. Film makes stories objective in a certain way. And like we made a bit of fun at the time at how overwrought Conrad Veidt's acting is in the original film adaptation.
Yeah.
But at least the expressionist style lets you visually externalize his off-kilter headspace so that this plays on film. And then, like, Mad Love figured out a way to do this story by shifting the focus away entirely and making the surgeon the bad guy. But here in 1960, in these very brightly lit modern sets, it's just kind of ridiculous that Orlac doesn't even know the nature of the operation performed on him. Like, was it a transplant? Was it something else? Like, this is 1960. Like, how did you go through a whole procedure in hospital with no one telling Orlac or Louise what was done? How do you not know that whether these are your hands or not?
With the asterisk of Orlac is a white guy who is super famous.
Yes.
Whose career is on his hands.
Yes.
He would know.
Yes.
Yes, we understand that 1960 and earlier, and even more recently, there are medical procedures done to people who are not white and not cis and not male. That is not shared with them.
Yeah, but in this
ended.
Yes, but in this particular case where it's
yes.
like your hands were what was fucked up and we fixed them, that you wouldn't know what they did. Like, a lot of times in those cases that you're alluding to, it's like you went into surgery for this thing and while we were at it, we did this other thing.
Yeah.
It's just, as this story becomes more and more set in the modern time, it gets more and more ridiculous to kind of buy. And this movie, like the 1920s version, puts a lot of emphasis on just scenes of Orlac being upset and paranoid that his hands might be someone else's.
But
like,
Mel Ferrer does not pull it off. Like,
no.
he's going for it, but also, like, the makers of the movie around it are not putting weight behind his performance either.
No. And yet the pacing of the story is such that, like, the first hour of this movie is just without Nero, without anything having happened in the plot, just him being worried. And if you're going to make that psychological thing the focus, you need to find visual ways to bring that out. And I just feel like what's happening here is by 1960, that kind of like Conrad Veidt style acting is not in style. Like, Mel Ferrer is a fine actor, but he's giving, you know, a realistic performance, which means that, like, it's not over the top enough to sell how
upset you would feel.
Right. And then nothing's happening with the cinematography or the set design or the editing or anything to, like, sell us on this guy's frame of mind. Like, in a very real sense, nothing happens in this movie.
Yeah.
Like, there's no tension. There are barely events in the story. Everything iconic in the original version is dealt with as quickly and as poorly as possible. Vast stretches of the movie go by without things happening. There are entire scenes that are completely pointless. Like, there's a whole scene where he, like, goes to the club and meets this sculptor who wants to sculpt his hands, and that makes him upset, and he runs out, and that sculptor's Donald Pleasance. And we didn't mention that scene in the synopsis at all because it has nothing to fucking do with anything. And the other thing that I found super frustrating was that if Orlac's mindset is the key focus of this version of the movie, his mindset is not consistent and doesn't make sense from scene to scene. There isn't like a progression.
Crescendo.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, there's no reason for him to believe his hands are Vassar's. It should be easily proven that they aren't. He never does anything with them anyway, except kind of sort of choking his wife, maybe. So it's all very clearly in his head. And the one thing that really frustrated me was, like, he leaves his wife because he's afraid. He goes to this seedy hotel. He meets Nero. Nero tells him, "Your hands are Vassar's, I know, because I know Vassar," thus confirming Orlac's fears. And yet the next thing that happens is Orlac gets over his fears and goes back to London and is fine for a while.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's kind of why I mean that the plot and the writing don't work.
Yeah.
I do want to say that, like, in the novel, as I said, a lot of it is from Louise's point, or I guess Yvonne's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very much like her woman's intuition is telling her something's wrong. She starts to see things.
Sure.
There's a spiritualist.
Yeah, a spiritualist. Yeah.
Yeah, like, do a seance and stuff.
Yeah,
There's
I remember stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing is it wasn't published as it eventually was published as a novel, but it was like quarterly magazine kind of style.
It was a serial.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then collected. And so it was kind of like just pump the shit out.
Yeah.
And so the novel itself might also not wholly make sense. And unfortunately, in the case of the 1960 movie, that's at least accurate in its adaptation.
But it's like, it's so, this movie does feel so episodic that way. Like, there are scenes late in the movie of him like going to a park and like dogs not liking him and small children not liking him. And ooh, does that mean he has a murderer's hands? And those types of scenes should have been at the start of the damn movie.
Yeah.
Like, there's no consistency to how things build up. The attempts to gaslight him are so laughably fake. Like, at one point they send Li Long in a widow's outfit to Louise to be like, I'm the widow of Vassar and your husband has something of my husband's and I'm so sad. But at this point, like, Vassar's been dead for like a year.
Literally, it's in the text. Like, they say, oh yeah, it's the year anniversary.
Yeah, and like, if Vassar was this famous strangler, even if he's later proven innocent, which the movie
speeds past.
Right. But also, like, did they make it so he was still guillotined, right? Like, they did execute him.
He is dead.
And then they found out he was innocent. Okay, great. Like, okay, I get that it's 1960 and you don't have Google. I get that. I still feel like whether Vassar had a wife or not would be like easy to find out relatively soon after that encounter. Like, all of these things are really easy to prove false.
I feel like the best scene of this movie is that sexually explicit attempted strangling.
Which I thought was nowhere near as good as it could have been.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that kind of puts into perspective the rest of this movie. And it almost felt like the movie in that scene was trying to hint towards something akin to like specifically the 40s Jekyll and Hyde.
Sure, like a psychosexual element.
Yes.
The thing
but it doesn't actually manage to do anything.
It's 1960. Like, one thing I was kind of interested in was like, how would a more psychological take on Hands of Orlac look? That we have this kind of more modern, like, I don't know. I keep expecting, I guess it's too much to ask for it to come so soon afterwards, but I keep expecting to see more of a sea change after Psycho.
Yeah, I think we'll be seeing that in the next year.
For sure.
One thing that I did notice that like shows that either the makers of the movie were doing this because they were bored with the material or because they were trying to actually do something with it is the use of mirrors.
Okay.
In this movie. In that first hour before Nero shows up, as you said, it drags. But mirrors are always in the shot, especially when Orlac is like doubting himself. And I wonder if there's something that the filmmakers are trying to do. It's hard to shoot with the mirror. And there are times that like the mirror stays in the place, but like the camera's like moving kind of where they have to do work to hide it.
Sure.
So either these guys are just like bored and they're trying to make challenges for themselves, or they're trying to do something about the way that you see yourself.
Huh. I hadn't noticed the mirrors. Interesting.
That's the problem. It's so subtle and like, again, it has no crescendo, has no growth. It's just there. It doesn't intensify. It falls flat. Like there's nothing more to it than like, oh, neat. They tried to do a thing.
Yeah. I was really disappointed because in reading up on the director, I had read that like he had movies in the 30s that had like run afoul of the censors. And so I was like, oh, I wonder what it'll be like now that it's 1960 and he kind of doesn't have to worry about that kind of stuff anymore. And it turns out he's got nothing for us here. Like I said earlier, the movie feels like it's not interested in telling its own story. Like it feels like someone came to this director and was like, hey, you're doing the next Hands of Orlac movie. And he was like, really? Do I have to? Like, there are choices of editing and music throughout this that regularly undercut any tension that might threaten to consider existing in this runtime, like this jazz score that does nothing.
I was trying to be really like lenient with its musical choice, because there have been times in the past where like jazz is what's contemporary. So it'd be like, you know, we're watching a modern horror movie and I don't know, Hoser starts playing.
It's got
Chapel
like
Rowan starts playing.
Yeah.
Like, so it would just be like, you know, what's contemporary to the time. So I was trying to be lenient, but it really, I do feel like there's like, they're cutting themselves by the knees.
Oh yeah, like there's a kind of jazz that I think can read as like horror jazz if you allow it to, that we've seen in other movies where like you and I personally didn't like the jazz, but it's like, okay, but you can see what they're going for. But this isn't that. This isn't like syncopated, like high beats per minute kind of like, oh, everything's crazy and weird jazz. This is like lounge jazz. This is like smooth, like don't worry about it, man. Like everything in this movie is so tame. Like I talked about how the hands aren't really much in terms of like the blood or the scars, but also like the plane crash is off camera.
Well, not exactly, because we just see an explosion in the sky.
Well, what we see is a dark horizon. We hear plane noises. There's a flash, like a white flash of light, and then we hear a crash sound. And it just struck me when we were watching it as how like cheap and tame and awful that is, given that like the original silent movie
is a literal train crash and like people are being pulled out, dying.
Oh God, yeah. Like the silent movie spends like a good first 10 minutes on like the harrowing horror of this train crash.
Yeah.
You've got the fact that like the only murder in the movie has nothing to do with Orlac.
Yeah.
He doesn't even...
It's right at the end.
He doesn't even kill Nero at the end.
No.
When he goes to fight Nero. Most of the movie is very brightly lit with long dialogue scenes that don't really go anywhere.
One positive thing, Christopher Lee speaking French.
Oh, yeah.
Very charming, very good, but it's not with the rest of the movie.
It's like, I can understand going into it, the filmmakers looking at the novel and the older versions of the story, the previous two movies, and deciding that maybe that like grand guignol aspect of it is a little too over the top for 1960. Like we
maybe
need
a little too old fashioned.
Right. Like we need to like make it more realistic, a little bit more down to earth, but you cannot just replace it with this hack story about a magician con man.
Yeah.
Like okay, you gave the novel synopsis. The silent movie is very close to it. In the silent version, the blackmailer is the surgeon's assistant. So he sees Orlac get the surgery and it gives him the idea to like blackmail Orlac. And it means that Orlac like is kind of convinced that this guy might be Vassar when like that confrontation happens. The villain makes sense. In Mad Love, they make the whole movie into a story about the villain by making the surgeon the villain and making it about how he wants to like drive Orlac mad so he can get with Orlac's wife. And that's all very over the top. But like, as much as I like Christopher Lee, the nature of his character here, this like con man magician who like hates being a magician and like doesn't like Orlac because Orlac's more famous than him. It just feels...
It doesn't make any sense.
It just feels like some TV level shit. Like this is the villain that you'd expect in like a bad TV show of this time. There's like barely a half hour worth of actual story in this movie, let alone 100 minutes. Everything in here is a missed opportunity at every possible moment. Like it staggers me that at any point someone writing or filming this thought that the changes they were making to the story were improvements in any way. Like, how do you think that?
So I don't have anything else to say.
I just want to give the audience like a sense of the pacing here. We've talked about this. The surgery is 10 minutes into the movie. It is then another 40 minutes before Nero overhears that Orlac is afraid his hands are Vassar's, and the plot actually starts. And that 40 minutes, I was thinking about it, how to describe what was going on. And I realized it's 40 minutes of literal hand-wringing.
Yeah.
Like, literally, that's what's happening. It is fully an hour and 30 minutes into this hour and 40-minute movie that the first suspenseful thing happens, which is the scene where maybe Orlac might be trying to kill his wife.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
So you brought up earlier that you think that this isn't horror.
Mm-hmm.
For me, like, if it is horror, it's super bad.
Yes.
But this is like, let's go all the way back to episode 1, where we said, you know it when you see it.
Yeah.
This isn't horror, but it's marketing.
Yes.
So I looked up the posters.
Yes.
One poster is very like thriller, very like, almost James Bond-esque of this time of like, oh, what's going to happen to these people? There is one that feels a little bit more horror. It has like the tagline of a frightening nightmare of hands he can't control. The tagline on the more like psychological thriller poster is like, melody or murder in these hands. So like, I feel like even the marketing campaign wasn't quite sure where to go, but it is leaning towards horror. So it's like, I don't know. How do we determine if this like fully was marketed as horror and therefore should be ranked as the new bottom? Or like, what do we do here?
I watched the trailer.
Okay.
Which goes with the hands of Orlac, the hands of a murderer, as kind of like the vibe. They definitely try to sell it as horror. I feel like it's getting sold as horror because the previous 2 movie versions were horror. But frankly, like, recently we watched the movie Blood and Roses by Roger Vadim, and I talked a little bit recently about how that movie keeps coming up in my job, weirdly enough. And we decided that that wasn't horror.
Yeah.
And
true.
that is way closer to horror than this, because that at least is like delving into gothic romance vampire stuff. The thing about this is, there have been times in the past where we've said, just because a movie isn't scary doesn't mean it's not horror, because it just means that it's bad horror, right? But the sense I get watching this, I don't get the sense that the filmmakers were even trying to be scary. I don't think they were trying to make a horror movie, regardless of what it was marketed as. I don't think there's no sense here that the filmmakers were thinking about this in a horror way, that they were shooting it in a horror style, that they were making any attempt for that. Like, the closest stuff to horror we get in here are scenes that are over so quickly, it feels like the filmmakers are embarrassed that they're in the movie.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So cool. This isn't horror. This is going on the miscellaneous part of the list.
Yes, absolutely. We happened to have a friend over when we watched this, and I just felt so bad that like they had to sit and watch this terrible fucking movie with us.
But it also put into context that like the confrontation with like the hook hands and whatever, they were like, what the fuck is this?
Why is this in the movie?
Because they have no context of the novel, of the previous 2 versions. So it just really further underlines that this is not a good movie.
Yeah, it's a scene that like is only in the movie because it's the most iconic scene in the story. It makes no sense for it to happen in this version of the story, right?
Yeah.
It reminds me a lot of discussions we've had in the past about remakes getting so far away from the source material that they forget like why certain things are in the source material.
Yeah. Well, folks, if you would like to see the other movies on the miscellaneous part of the list, you can head to our website, screamscenepodcast.com. There you can find links to the other episodes that we have mentioned today, as well as our appeals box. If you feel very strongly that this should be ranked and we should consider it horror, please send us a note through our Ask box on Tumblr or email us at screamscenepodcast@gmail.com.
Scream Scene updates on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, SoundCloud, Spotify, and many other podcasting apps. If you want to make sure that you never miss an episode, you can subscribe to our RSS feed. And if you'd like to help the show out, you can become a patron of the night by heading over to our Patreon at patreon.com/ScreamScenePodcast, where you can sign up for as little as $1 a month. Patrons at the $1 level get thanked on the show. At $5, you get access to bonus audio content from past episodes. At the $10 level, there's essays and short stories and movie reviews. And there's a whole backlog of like really cool special bonus stuff we've done for the Patreon over the years. If you're enjoying the regular show and you just want more of it, head on over to patreon.com/ScreamScenePodcast.
So, Ben, what are we watching next week?
Next week, Sarah, we are headed over to the UK for a film adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. But I do need to make it clear that this is not related to the Roger Corman and Vincent Price Poe movies, of which we've only seen one so far, House of Usher, but there's a whole series of those through the 60s, so I know people might be like looking forward to more of those. I need to make it clear, this is not that. But it is a movie adaptation of Telltale Heart.
Okay. You only told me that it was Telltale Heart, so I was thinking Corman. But
yeah.
Fuck.
No, I don't, sorry to get your hopes up. Hopefully it'll be good.
Time will tell. This is really interesting, too, because I'm heading to Baltimore for work in a couple weeks, and I'm going to go see Edgar Allan Poe's grave. Cool. It's within walking distance of the hotel.
Nice.
Cool. Things aligned. Well, we will see you then, creatures of the night.
Bye.
Bye.